Persia, now known as Iran, holds one of the longest and most continuous histories in the world. Long before Rome existed, ancient Persia was home to peoples, cities, and cultures that helped shape the great empires of antiquity. Located between Europe and Asia, this region became a strategic center of trade, power, and influence. Over the centuries, the Persian Empire rose, fell, and rose again many times, preserving its identity despite invasions and conquests. Kings like Cyrus the Great, empires such as the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian, along with conflicts with Greeks, Romans, and Arabs, all shaped its path. This is the full story of Persia, told from beginning to end in a continuous timeline spanning millennia, a civilization that never ceased to exist. From the mountains of the Iranian plateau to the palaces of legendary kings, the history of Persia spans millennia of conquests, revolutions, renaissances, and resilience. In this documentary, you will follow a journey that begins with the ancient peoples who shaped one of the longest-lasting civilizations on Earth, passes through empires that challenged the world, and reaches the conflicts and alliances that still define modern Iran. We will explore how a culture survived invasions, empires, and religious transformations while keeping alive an identity that transcended time. This is more than the story of a country. It is the account of a people who refused to vanish. Get ready to uncover, in detail, the complete history of the Persian Empire. Long before anything called the Persian Empire existed, the vast plateaus and valleys of ancient Iran were already inhabited by societies flourishing between mountains and deserts. The region, favored by diverse climates and access to natural routes, saw the birth of some of the world's earliest agricultural communities. Around 7200 BCE, in the southwest of present-day Iran, villages emerged that domesticated grains, raised livestock, and cultivated grapes, among the earliest records of winemaking in human history. These early communities depended deeply on nature's rhythms, and their way of life reflected a close connection to the land, the stars, and the elements that governed fertility and survival. In the area now known as Khuzestan province, one of Iran's oldest civilizations emerged, the Elamites. Around 3200 BCE, they had already formed organized cities with political structures, temples, and palaces. Their most important center was Susa, a city that would remain relevant for thousands of years under various empires. The Elamites had their own language, distinct from both Sumerian and Akkadian, and developed a cuneiform script adapted to their needs. This civilization maintained commercial and sometimes hostile relations with Mesopotamia, especially with the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Sumerians, contributing to the formation of a distinct cultural identity in ancient Persia. While Mesopotamian peoples thrived on wide, fertile plains nourished by rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, the inhabitants of the Iranian plateau developed a mountainous civilization. This geographical difference also shaped their cultures. Mountain peoples, such as the ancestors of the Persians and Medes, lived in less predictable regions with more difficult agriculture and drier climates. This encouraged more mobile, decentralized, and resilient societies. Over time, these groups formed nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes that expanded into the plains and founded enduring kingdoms. It was a challenging yet strategic environment, connecting east and west, north and south of Asia. Beyond their agricultural practices and social systems, the peoples of ancient Iran had spiritual beliefs that reflected their surroundings. Natural elements like fire, water, and earth were revered as sacred forces. There was not yet a structured religion like Zoroastrianism, but a perception of dualities, light and darkness, order and chaos, already influenced their future traditions. Archaeological sites like Chogha-Zanbil, with its ziggurats dedicated to local gods, show that these people built monumental temples and developed their own mythologies. This religiosity would later be absorbed and reshaped by prophets and emperors. Over time, the Elamite societies began to fragment under the pressure of new Indo-Aryan peoples migrating from the north through the Central Asian steppes. By around 1500 BCE, groups such as the Medes and Persians began settling in western and central Iran. These peoples brought Indo-European languages, warrior traditions, and a new tribal organization that contrasted with the Elamites' urban lifestyle. The transition was gradual, but it marked a fundamental change in the region's ethnic and cultural makeup, laying the groundwork for the future Persian empires that would dominate the history of Persia. This proto-historical period, often overlooked in broad summaries of Iran's history, is essential to understand how Persia was able over the following centuries to resist, absorb, and survive countless invasions. It was a land that already had memory, identity, and roots long before it welcomed kings and armies. And it is precisely from those deep roots that one of the most emblematic figures in the history of Persia would emerge, Cyrus the Great, a leader who would forever change the fate of the ancient world.
After the arrival of Indo-Aryan peoples on the Iranian plateau, two major cultures began to form that would play central roles in the future history of Persia: the Medes and the Persians. The Medes settled mainly in the western region of modern-day Iran, known as Media, forming tribal confederations that gradually developed more centralized structures. The Persians, in turn, established themselves further south in the region of Parsa, near the Persian Gulf. By the 8th century BCE, the Medes had become the dominant power in the region, even capable of challenging the mighty Assyrian Empire. Their political organization, though rudimentary, laid a strong foundation for the first Iranian empires to emerge. The most prominent Median king was Cyaxares, who unified the Median tribes and built a structured army with divisions of cavalry, archers, and infantry. With this reorganized military force, he allied with the Babylonians and helped destroy Nineveh in 612 BCE, bringing about the fall of the Assyrian Empire. This victory strengthened Median control across a vast territory, stretching from eastern Anatolia to the borders of India. It was in this context that a new figure emerged in the south, Cyrus, the son of Cambyses I, king of Persia. At the time, the Persians were still under Median rule, but retained their distinct identity, with their territory considered a peripheral extension of the Northern Empire. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus led a decisive revolt against Median rule. According to chronicles, he defeated Astyages, the last Median king, consolidating control over both regions and initiating the Achaemenid Empire. This conquest marked not only the union of Medes and Persians, but also the birth of a new imperial model, vast, diverse, and governed through integration rather than oppression. Cyrus adopted a highly unusual approach for his time, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their languages, religions, and customs as long as they submitted to imperial authority. This strategy solidified Persian power without provoking constant rebellions, creating a foundation for a long-lasting administrative system. Cyrus's fame quickly spread throughout the Near East. He conquered Lydia in Anatolia, defeating King Croesus and incorporating key Greek cities in Asia Minor into his realm. Then he marched eastward and subdued several Central Asian tribes, extending the Persian Empire's borders to the Jaxartes River. One of his most symbolic campaigns was against Babylon in 539 BCE, where he took the city with little resistance and freed the Jews who had been exiled since the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. This act earned Cyrus the Great the enduring respect of the Jewish people and recognition in later religious traditions. He's even mentioned in the Bible as an instrument of divine will. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus, soon became the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, encompassing Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Libya, Parthia, Persia, and parts of Central Asia. Its government was decentralized, with satraps, regional governors, who reported to the central authority but had autonomy to manage local matters. Additionally, Cyrus established a fixed tribute system and honored regional agreements. This structure enabled effective control over diverse cultures and peoples, preventing premature collapse and ensuring administrative cohesion across vast distances. Cyrus's rule was not based solely on military conquest, but also on imperial propaganda. Documents like the Cyrus Cylinder, discovered in Babylon, praise his image as a liberator, peacemaker, and defender of local traditions. These records show how he presented himself as a legitimate ruler, not only to the Persians, but also to the conquered peoples. His political and religious messaging, adapted to each culture, reinforced his image as a just authority. This perception was crucial in consolidating his role as the founder of Persian civilization in its imperial form. Zoroastrianism, still emerging at the time, began influencing the court, introducing concepts of order, truth, and harmony, principles that would echo throughout the structure of the Persian Empire. Cyrus died in battle around 530 BCE during a campaign against the Massagetae north of modern-day Iran. His body was buried in Pasargadae, a city he had founded, with a mausoleum that still stands today as one of the key symbols of ancient Persia. His legacy was immediately continued by his son, Cambyses II, who would carry on the expansionist campaigns. But what Cyrus the Great had built was more than territory. He created an imperial model that would serve as a reference for centuries, even influencing documents like the United States Declaration of Independence. With his death, a new phase in the history of Persia began, now under a consolidated dynasty, but soon facing growing internal and external challenges.
With the rapid expansion initiated by Cyrus the Great, the need arose to transform the Persian Empire into an administrative machine capable of managing diverse peoples across immense territories. After his death, this task was continued by Cambyses II, and especially Darius I, who took the throne in 522 BCE and restructured the imperial administration into an innovative system for its time. The Achaemenid Empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a direct representative of the king. In total, around 20 satrapies were established, each with clearly defined fiscal, military, and administrative duties. This controlled decentralization allowed for more agile local decisions without compromising the central authority of the King of Kings. Despite the relative autonomy of the satraps, the imperial center maintained strict control over their actions. Officials appointed directly by the court were tasked with overseeing the provinces, including the king's eyes and ears, who traveled anonymously and secretly through the satrapies, inspecting for abuses of power or corruption. The tax system was standardized. Each satrapy was required to deliver a fixed annual tribute, usually in silver, livestock, or local goods. These resources filled the royal treasury and sustained military campaigns, public works, and the maintenance of an exceptionally sophisticated court. The official currency, the daric, began circulating throughout the empire, promoting economic integration and facilitating trade across the Persian territory. Logistics was also a central pillar of the administrative structure. Darius I created an imperial road system that connected all parts of the Achaemenid Empire, the most famous being the Royal Road, which linked Susa to Sardis over nearly 2,700 kilometers. Along these routes, relay stations with horses, couriers, and lodging were established. The imperial postal system could transmit orders and messages from the center to the edges of the empire within days, a remarkable logistical feat for ancient standards. This communication network allowed the king to closely monitor regional decisions and respond quickly to threats, ensuring stability even during times of crisis. The Achaemenid army reflected the empire's diversity. Darius organized his forces with structure, relying on an elite corps known as the Immortals, composed of 10,000 highly trained Persian soldiers. This unit was constantly replenished. Whenever a soldier fell, another would take his place immediately, keeping the number always constant. Beyond the Immortals, the army gathered contingents from various ethnic groups: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Scythians, each with their own attire, weapons, and tactics. The military not only defended the empire, but also symbolized its cohesion. Soldiers from across ancient Persia marched under a single banner, serving the same central power. The imperial capitals were also politically and symbolically planned. Darius I rebuilt and expanded Persepolis, transforming it into a majestic ceremonial center where ambassadors and governors from all over the empire gathered to pay homage to the king. The city featured sculptures, reliefs, and inscriptions glorifying the harmony among conquered peoples, portraying them as allies rather than subdued enemies. This imperial iconography was a tool of cultural integration, projecting an image of stability, order, and mutual respect, even amid domination. It also reinforced the idea that the Persian Empire was a superior civilization, guided by justice and wisdom. In the legal realm, the Achaemenid Empire allowed local legal systems to coexist with central directives from the palace. Each region could maintain its own codes and legal traditions as long as they did not contradict royal authority. This respect for legal diversity fostered loyalty among the conquered populations, who felt represented within the state apparatus. Darius himself ordered the compilation of laws in various parts of the empire, demonstrating not only tolerance but also a genuine interest in understanding and administering regional customs. This approach helped prevent revolts and facilitated the governance of a population numbering in the millions, spread across territories with distinct cultures, languages, and religions. The administrative structure of the Achaemenid Empire proved so effective that it influenced future systems of governance for centuries, even beyond Persia. The satrapy model, auditing systems, military mobility, and postal service were later imitated by empires such as Rome and Byzantium. This solid foundation of organization allowed the Persian Empire to maintain cohesion for nearly 2 centuries, even amid internal and external challenges. However, as Darius's successors began facing new threats, particularly from the West, this administrative structure would soon be tested in a series of conflicts that would become known in the history of Persia as the famous Greco-Persian Wars.
The westward expansion of the Achaemenid Empire inevitably led to conflict with the Greek city-states, particularly those located along the coast of Asia Minor in a region known as Ionia. These Greek cities, though culturally tied to mainland Greece, had been under Persian control since the campaigns of Cyrus the Great. However, in 499 BCE, the Ionian revolt broke out when Miletus, with limited support from Athens and Eretria, tried to break free from Persian rule. Darius I, then on the throne, responded forcefully, crushing the revolt and destroying Miletus in 494 BCE. Although the uprising was suppressed, it left a deep mark.
The Persian king began to see Athens as a direct threat to imperial stability and decided to organize a punitive expedition to secure control of the region. In 490 BCE, Darius launched the first major Persian military campaign against mainland Greece, known as the First Persian War. Persian forces landed on the plain of Marathon, north of Athens. A swift victory was expected, but the Athenian army, led by Miltiades, achieved a surprising triumph. Despite being outnumbered, the Greek hoplites used effective tactics and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, forcing a Persian retreat. This defeat momentarily weakened Persian momentum, but intensified their desire for revenge. The victory at Marathon became a symbol for the Greeks, while the Persians prepared a far larger offensive that would soon follow under new leadership. The death of Darius I in 846 BCE brought his son Xerxes to the throne, and it was he who resumed the project of subduing Greece. 4 years later, in 480 BCE, Xerxes assembled one of the largest armies of antiquity and crossed the Hellespont on a bridge of boats, launching the Second Persian War. This campaign is remembered for iconic battles that marked the history of Persia and Greece. The first was the Battle of Thermopylae, where a small Greek force led by the Spartan king Leonidas held off the massive Persian army for 3 days. Though defeated, the defenders of Thermopylae became symbols of resistance. Shortly after, Xerxes marched on Athens, which had been evacuated and was burned by the invaders. Meanwhile, the Greek navy was preparing a counterstrike. At Salamis, also in 480 BCE, the Athenians under Themistocles used their knowledge of the terrain to lure the Persian fleet into a narrow strait, where the larger enemy ships lost their advantage. The result was a decisive Greek victory, with much of the Persian navy destroyed. Without naval support and facing logistical challenges in sustaining his enormous army in Greece, Xerxes withdrew, leaving a force under Mardonius. The following year, in 479 BCE, the Greeks formed a coalition and faced the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. Mardonius was killed, and the Persians were decisively defeated on Greek soil, ending their campaign to invade the Hellenic world. The Greco-Persian Wars were not only military clashes, but also a confrontation between two distinct worldviews. On one side, the centralized, multicultural, vast Persian Empire. On the other, the independent, fragmented Greek city-states, driven by a shared sense of autonomy. It's important to note that many Greek cities sided with Persia or remained neutral. The conflict cannot be reduced to a simplistic clash between East and West, as it is often portrayed. What unfolded was a series of strategic decisions, pragmatic alliances, and local disputes set against a broader and more complex international backdrop than epic retellings suggest. From the Persian Empire's perspective, the campaigns against Greece represented a high cost, but did not destabilize the imperial structure as a whole. Even with defeats on Greek soil, the empire remained cohesive and dominant across vast regions of the East. Persian control over Ionia was re-established and lasted for over a century. However, the Greco-Persian Wars temporarily weakened the Achaemenid Empire's aura of invincibility, paving the way for the rise of Greek influence and, in the long term, for the future offensive by Alexander the Great. For now, though, the empire would recover internally, maintaining control of most of the known world's trade routes and resource-rich regions. The memories of these wars remained vivid in both Greece and Persia. For the Greeks, they became foundational legends, a source of cultural and military pride. For the Persians, they were significant episodes among many other confrontations faced by the empire. The battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea would be remembered for millennia, each carrying its own myths and interpretations. While the Greeks celebrated their resistance, the Persian kings continued to rule one of the greatest empires of antiquity, now turning their ambitions elsewhere. Even so, tensions between Greeks and Persians would not vanish entirely and would erupt again decades later with the arrival of a new conqueror from the West.
After the Greco-Persian Wars, the Achaemenid Empire continued to exist as the greatest power in the known world. Behind this grandeur, however, internal fractures began to emerge: succession disputes, revolts in the provinces, and a growing disconnect between the imperial center and its peripheral regions. When Darius III ascended the throne in 336 BCE, the empire was already facing considerable challenges. In that same year, in the kingdom of Macedon, Alexander, son of Philip II, took command of a disciplined and ambitious army. Within a few years, he unified the Greek world under his leadership and launched an offensive against Persia, invoking revenge for earlier invasions while seeking to consolidate his own authority over both the Hellenic and Eastern worlds. Alexander's first major victory against the Persians came in 334 BCE at the Battle of the Granicus River in Asia Minor. He then defeated Darius III again at Issus in 333 BCE, forcing the Persian king to flee the battlefield. Rather than marching directly into the heart of Persia, Alexander turned south, capturing Phoenician cities, including Tyre, and later Egypt, where he was received as a liberator. Only then did he advance toward the core of the Persian Empire. In 331 BCE, the two forces met again at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander's army, though outnumbered, decisively defeated Darius III. This confrontation marked the practical end of Achaemenid control over the Near East. Darius III fled once more, attempting to regroup in the eastern provinces, but he was betrayed by his own satraps and assassinated while on the move. Upon learning of his rival's death, Alexander proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to the Persian Empire. This claim was not merely symbolic. The Macedonian adopted Persian dress, upheld Eastern court ceremonies, and appointed Persians to positions of trust within his administration. The most striking demonstration of his dominance came with his arrival at Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital. When Alexander entered the city in 330 BCE, he was received as a conqueror, though many inhabitants still retained loyalty to the fallen dynasty. In one of the most debated episodes of his career, Alexander ordered or allowed Persepolis to be looted and set ablaze. The reasons for this act continue to be discussed by historians. Some view it as symbolic retaliation for the destruction of Athens by Xerxes during the Greco-Persian Wars. Others suggest it was an impulsive act, influenced by alcohol during a celebratory banquet. Another interpretation holds that the burning was deliberate, intended to mark the definitive end of the Achaemenid Empire and prevent any attempt at restoration. What remains certain is that Persepolis, the foremost symbol of Persian imperial power, was reduced to ruins, and its scorched columns still stand as witnesses to the collapse of an era. Despite this act of destruction, Alexander did not abandon the Persian legacy. On the contrary, he adopted many administrative practices of the Achaemenid Empire, including the continued use of satraps and the preservation of local governance structures. He also encouraged cultural integration between Greeks and Persians, promoting intermarriage and incorporating Eastern soldiers into his army. This process, known as Hellenism, did not represent merely the imposition of Greek culture, but an attempt to create a shared identity linking East and West. Alexander envisioned the universal empire, unified by efficient administration, a multicultural elite, and a common language, Koine Greek. Even after the fall of Persepolis, Alexander continued his eastern campaigns, crossing the mountains of Iran and encountering fierce resistance in regions such as Bactria and Sogdiana. These campaigns involved difficult battles and unstable alliances, yet Alexander pressed on until reaching India. There, however, his advance met its limit
when his exhausted troops refused to continue. Upon returning westward, he established his capital in Babylon, planning further reforms and expansions. His sudden death in 323 BCE, without a capable heir, brought an abrupt end to his unified rule. In the aftermath, his empire was divided among his generals, the Diadochi, fragmenting the authority that had briefly replaced Persian domination. Alexander's conquest and the destruction of Persepolis formally ended the cycle of the Achaemenid Empire, but they did not erase Persian culture. Traditions, religions, customs, and systems of organization remained alive, now fused with Hellenistic elements. Persia became part of the Hellenistic world while preserving its distinct identity, influencing the new kingdoms that emerged after the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. The fall of Persepolis was not the end of the history of Persia, only the end of a chapter. Soon a new order would arise in the region, shaped by another dynasty of Iranian origin, the Parthians, who would restore a renewed form of Persian rule across the East.
After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, his vast empire was quickly divided among his generals, the so-called Diadochi. The eastern portion, which included the former Persian Empire, fell under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, founded by Seleucus I Nicator. This new order marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period, during which Greek cultural elements were imposed or fused with local traditions. In ancient Iran, the Seleucids sought to preserve Persian administrative structures while aggressively promoting Hellenic culture, encouraging the foundation of Greek cities and spreading the conqueror's language, architecture, and religion. This era created a tense coexistence between the Persian legacy and the imported values of Greece. Zoroastrianism, until then a cornerstone of Persian identity, now coexisted with Greek and Egyptian cults in a context of religious syncretism. Although the Hellenistic elite held the highest offices, the local population retained its beliefs, rituals, and traditions. Over time, mixed elites emerged, Hellenized Iranians who served the Seleucid administration but still preserved links to their Persian heritage. This cultural fusion was reflected in art, literature, and city planning, creating a hybrid landscape where Greek columns rose over Achaemenid ruins. Nevertheless, foreign rule was viewed with suspicion by much of the population, who longed for the return of a truly Iranian dynasty. The Seleucid dynasty's fragility became evident by the 3rd century BCE, as rebellions grew and independent powers emerged in the eastern regions. Among these groups were the Parthians, from the region of Parthia in the northeast of modern-day Iran. Of Iranian origin, the Parthians descended from the Scythians and maintained strong equestrian and military traditions. In 247 BCE, Xerxes I led a successful revolt against the Seleucids and founded the Achaemenid dynasty, which gradually expanded its territory over former Persian satrapies. Within just over a century, the Parthians expelled the Hellenists from most of Iran and established a new order blending Achaemenid political practices with a tribal and decentralized style of governance. The Parthian Empire adopted a federative structure with semi-autonomous kingdoms and a warrior nobility that held significant influence over the central power. The capital often shifted between cities like Hecatopolis, Nisa, and Ctesiphon. Unlike the centralized Achaemenid model, the Parthians favored flexible administration, where personal loyalty to the king mattered more than institutional obedience. This gave regional rulers greater autonomy, but also left the empire vulnerable to internal disputes. Although the Parthian court was influenced by Hellenism, it revived ancient Persian symbols, including the use of Middle Parthian language, Zoroastrian religious practices, and traditional festivals such as Nowruz. While consolidating their power within Iran, the Parthians faced a new rival from the west, the Roman Republic, which was beginning to expand eastward.
The two empires clashed repeatedly in Mesopotamia and Armenia, initiating one of antiquity's longest-lasting rivalries. In 53 BCE, the Roman general Crassus suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Carrhae, where thousands of Roman soldiers were killed or captured. This victory elevated the prestige of the Parthian Empire, which demonstrated enough strength to resist one of the Western world's rising powers. Over the following centuries, Romans and Parthians would wage numerous wars, though neither side would achieve complete dominance over the other. Despite constant Roman pressure, the Parthian Empire remained one of Asia's principal political and commercial centers. Its strategic location allowed control of key trade routes, including sections of the Silk Road, which connected China to the Mediterranean. Goods like silk, spices, precious metals, and luxury fabrics passed through Parthian trading posts, enriching the local nobility and fostering the growth of commercial cities. The blend of Persian, Greek, Mesopotamian, and Central Asian influences made the empire a cosmopolitan hub, though marked by internal disputes and institutional fragility. Still, its longevity and ability to maintain Persian sovereignty in the face of Western expansion secured its place in the history of Iran. Over time, however, internal divisions and growing Roman pressure began to weaken the Arsacid dynasty. The lack of clear succession in various periods led to civil wars among Parthian nobles, further destabilizing the empire's structure. Meanwhile, a new Persian group was gaining strength in the south of Iran, led by a dynasty claiming direct descent from the Achaemenids, the Sassanids. In 224 CE, this group defeated the last Parthian king and established a new era of centralization and revival of classical Persian identity. But before that, the Parthians would leave a lasting legacy as the restorers of Iranian sovereignty after Hellenistic domination, keeping the flame of Persian civilization alive for nearly 5 centuries.
The rise of the Sasanian Empire marked a new era of centralization and cultural revival for Persian civilization. In 224 CE, Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, and established the Sasanian dynasty, claiming direct descent from the ancient Achaemenids. Unlike the Parthians, who maintained a decentralized tribal system, the Sasanians imposed a highly centralized government, with strict administrative hierarchy and absolute authority concentrated in the Shah. This political transformation brought greater territorial control and drove a series of fiscal, military, and legal reforms. The new capital was established in Ctesiphon on the banks of the Tigris River, which would become one of the most important urban centers of late antiquity. One of the foundational pillars of the Sasanian regime was Zoroastrianism, which became the official religion of the empire. The Sasanian kings assumed not only the role of earthly rulers, but also defenders of the faith, in direct alliance with the Zoroastrian clergy. This union between state and religion allowed the empire to consolidate a renewed Persian identity, now deeply shaped by religious elements. Fire temples were constructed in many regions, and Zoroastrian doctrine was standardized, with sacred texts compiled and teachings unified. Persian culture became structured around principles of cosmic order, moral dualism, and reverence for truth, foundations that would later influence religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Manichaeism. Economically, the Sasanian Empire became a vital link in the Silk Road. Controlling strategic territories that connected East and West, the Persians profited from the trade of Chinese silk, Indian spices, textiles, metals, and precious stones. Cities located along these routes flourished, becoming centers of craftsmanship, knowledge, and cosmopolitanism. The Sasanians also invested in infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and caravanserais were expanded to facilitate the movement of goods and armies. The Sasanian currency, the silver drachm, became widely accepted, reflecting the empire's economic solidity.
This robust commercial system sustained not only the ruling elite, but also funded military campaigns and major public works. Culturally, the Sasanians promoted a flourishing of art, architecture, and intellectual life. Monumental palaces, stone reliefs, and frescoes depicted the grandeur at a court, military victories, and religious ceremonies. Literature in Middle Persian developed, preserving ancient myths, historical records, and philosophical treatises. Medicine and astronomy received special attention, with schools founded in cities such as Gundashapur, where Persian, Indian, Greek, and even Nestorian Christian scholars gathered. This atmosphere of intellectual exchange transformed the empire into one of the most advanced centers of knowledge in the ancient world. Revitalized under the Sasanians, Persian civilization deeply influenced its neighbors, including the Byzantine Empire. The relationship between Sasanians and Byzantines was marked by constant rivalry, alternating between war and diplomacy. The two empires clashed in dozens of military campaigns, disputing control over Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Syria. Despite hostilities, they mutually influenced one another. Military strategies, architecture, fashion, and even administrative practices circulated between the courts of Ctesiphon and Constantinople. This ongoing tension created a balance of power in the Near East for centuries, until a new destabilizing force emerged, the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. But before that, the Sasanian Empire would still face internal challenges, such as succession crises, noble revolts, and religious tensions. Religion, which had been a tool of cohesion, also became a source of conflict. The strengthening of official Zoroastrianism led to the persecution of religious minorities such as Christians, Manichaeans, Buddhists, and Jews. These tensions weakened internal stability, especially in frontier regions where external influences were strongest. Even so, the Sasanians maintained an efficient administration and a powerful army with heavily armored cavalry units, the famous Clibanarii. These forces were feared by their enemies and played a key role in repelling external threats, including invasions by the Huns and Turks. Defending the empire was a constant task, demanding ever-increasing resources from the state apparatus. In the early 6th century, the Sasanian Empire reached its peak under the rule of Khosrow II, who managed to conquer Byzantine territories as far as Egypt. However, this expansion was limited duration. Soon after, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a devastating counteroffensive, reclaiming lost territories and invading the Persian heartland. In the chaos, the empire plunged into civil wars and internal disputes that weakened its ability to respond. When the Muslim Arab armies began their conquests, they encountered an exhausted and divided empire. Still, the Sasanian legacy would endure in art, politics, religion, and the historical memory of ancient Iran. The Sasanian Empire would be remembered as an era of splendor, resilience, and lasting influence.
In the early 7th century, the Sasanian Empire faced one of the most turbulent periods in its history. If the prolonged wars with the Byzantine Empire, culminating in Heraclius's campaigns between 622 and 628, Persian territory was left devastated, with cities looted, resources depleted, and populations exhausted. Internal disputes increased. Emperors were deposed and assassinated in succession, while nobles fought for power amid chaos. This structural fragility undermined the empire's cohesion and prevented a unified response to a new threat emerging from the south, the Arab Caliphate, driven by the recent rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula under the leadership of Muhammad and later his successors. After Muhammad's death in 632, the caliphs of the so-called Rashidun Caliphate launched a series of military campaigns beyond Arabia. Their goal was to expand Islamic power and spread the teachings of the Quran.
While the Byzantine Empire struggled to recover from its wars with the Sasanians, Arab forces launched their first incursions along the borders of Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. Byzantine resistance was strong, but Persia's situation was even more dire. In 636, the decisive Battle of Al-Qadisiyah took place on the Mesopotamian plains. The Sasanian army, led by Rostam Farrukhzad, faced the Arab forces under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Despite their numerical superiority and heavy cavalry, the Sasanians were defeated after days of fighting. With the Arab victory at Qadisiyah and the subsequent capture of Ctesiphon, Muslim armies opened the way into Iran's heartland. The Sasanians tried to resist for a few more years under the leadership of the last Shah, Yazdegerd III, but were forced into constant retreat. In 642, the Battle of Nahavand sealed the empire's fate. The Arabs decisively defeated the remaining Persian forces, opening the Iranian plateau to Islamic conquest. Yazdegerd III continued fleeing, seeking support from regional governors, but was assassinated in 651, ending the Sasanian dynasty. In less than 2 decades, the former Persian Empire had ceased to exist as a sovereign political entity. Despite the military conquest, the Islamization of Persia did not happen overnight. Persian social and cultural structures showed resilience under the new rule. Although Islam became the dominant religion, many local elites adopted it more pragmatically than ideologically, with many remaining Zoroastrian for generations. Arabic was introduced as the official administrative language, but Middle Persian remained in cultural and popular use. The Islamic administration benefited from pre-existing Persian organization, integrating parts of the Sasanian bureaucracy into the new caliphal system. This institutional continuity was crucial for the stability of the Iranian provinces within the emerging Islamic world. In the years following the conquest, Persia was incorporated into the Rashidun Caliphate and later the Umayyad Caliphate. The imposition of different tax rates for Muslims and non-Muslims, such as the jizya, encouraged parts of the population to convert to Islam, though many did so only formally, secretly maintaining older practices. Direct repression of local religions like Zoroastrianism varied depending on the governor and time period, but overall the policy was one of gradual assimilation and cultural replacement. At the same time, the Arab conquerors began to admire aspects of Persian culture, from literature to administrative expertise, fostering a process of exchange and syncretism. Over time, Persians not only adapted to the new Islamic context, but played a fundamental role in transforming it. Iranian intellectuals contributed to the preservation and translation of ancient knowledge, influenced Islamic thought, and actively participated in shaping philosophical, legal, and scientific schools. Persian culture was so influential that it helped shape Islam in fundamental ways, from governance to literary production. Persian poetry flourished, and Middle Persian evolved into the new Persian language, Farsi, which would become one of the major tongues of Islamic civilization. So, although conquered, Persia transformed the very culture that had dominated it. The Islamic conquest of Persia did not erase its identity. On the contrary, it initiated a process of transformation in which Persian civilization found new forms of expression within the Islamic world. Even under foreign rule, Iranians preserved their heritage and deeply influenced the direction of the new empire. The old Persian Empire ceased to exist as an autonomous political power, but its history, culture, and worldview lived on, now fused with a new religious and geopolitical order. The next phase in the history of Persia would be defined by this fusion of tradition and renewal, giving rise to one of the richest cultural expressions of the medieval Islamic world. With the collapse of the Sassanid Empire and the incorporation of Persia into the Islamic Caliphate, Many might have imagined that the ancient Persian civilization would vanish in the face of the new religious and political order. However, the opposite happened. Instead of being erased, Persian culture began to exert increasing influence over the Islamic world. The administrative, literary, and intellectual sophistication of the Persians became essential for the consolidation of the caliphal empires. Many Sassanid bureaucratic structures were reused by the Arabs, who recognized in the Persian system a level of efficiency superior to their own. This process not only preserved essential elements of the Persian tradition, but elevated them to the core of Islamic power. During the Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, Persian presence became even more prominent. Many of the visas, bureaucrats, physicians, and intellectuals at court were of Persian origin. The Abbasid dynasty, although Arab, was deeply influenced by the Sassanid model of governance, adopting court protocols, ceremonial dress, and even the idea of a quasi-divine monarch, similar to the figure of the Shah. Moreover, there was a true cultural flourishing during this period, known as the Islamic Renaissance, which owed much to Persian contributions in philosophy, science, literature, and art. Persian ceased to be a mere legacy and became a living force within Islamic civilization. The Persian language, initially suppressed in favor of Arabic, resurfaced strongly from the 9th century onward. Writers like Ferdowsi, with his monumental Shahnameh, helped preserve Persia's history and identity through epic poetry. This literary revival coincided with the rise of Persian-origin Muslim dynasties, such as the Samanids, who promoted Iranian culture within an Islamic context. New Persian, or Farsi, influenced by Arabic structure but preserving the essence of the old tongue, became one of the main literary and administrative languages of the Islamic world. Its prestige was such that it was adopted even by non-Persian peoples, like the Turks and Indian Muslims, as a language of high culture and scholarship. Beyond literature, Persians also excelled in science and philosophy. Figures like Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, considered one of the greatest physicians of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, exemplified a central role of Iranians in the advancement of Islamic knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, alchemy, medicine, and logic were deeply developed by Persian scholars. Many of these contributions would later be translated into Latin and integrated into the European Renaissance, showing the global reach of Persia's intellectual legacy within the Islamic world. From a religious perspective, although Sunni Islam initially predominated, Persia also played a decisive role in the expansion of Shiite Islam. Over time, especially beginning with the Safavid dynasty in the 16th century, Shi'ism became the official religion of Persia, marking a clear distinction from the Sunni Arab world. This distinction further reinforced the uniqueness of the Iranian identity within the Islamic sphere. Instead of merely following Arab religious and political models, Iranians shaped their own version of Islam, deeply tied to their millennia-old cultural tradition. Politically, several post-Sassanid dynasties that emerged in Persia not only integrated into the Islamic world, but shaped its course. The Samanids, Buyids, Seljuks, and later the Safavids are examples of how Persians not only survived Islamic rule, but became leading actors within it. Instead of resisting outright, Iranians assimilated Islam and transformed it into an expression adapted to their culture. This fusion resulted in an Islamic civilization marked by distinctly Persian traits in palaces, poetry, architecture, and governance. Therefore, Persia's role in the Islamic world was not of subservience, but of co-authorship. The ancient civilization, conquered militarily, triumphed culturally. Its spirit survived and flourished, shaping the Islamic world so deeply that it would be impossible to conceive of medieval Islam without the active presence of the Persian legacy. Instead of disappearing, Persia was reborn within the very empire that absorbed it, and became one of its most sophisticated and resilient pillars.
The Mongol invasions of the 13th century represented one of the darkest chapters in the history of Persia. Led first by Genghis Khan and later by his generals and grandsons, the Mongols advanced violently across Persian territory, destroying entire cities, annihilating populations, and dismantling centuries of civilizational development. The campaign of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, culminated in the capture of Baghdad in 1258, but long before that, numerous Persian cities had already been devastated. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, and Tabriz suffered catastrophic human and material losses. Historical estimates suggested millions of people died during the Mongol campaigns in the region, creating a profound rupture in the social, economic, and cultural foundations of Persia. The psychological impact of these invasions was as severe as the physical destruction. Contemporary chronicles describe rivers stained with blood, towers of human skulls erected at city gates, and ancient libraries burned to their final pages. The Mongols did not merely conquer, they humiliated cities, erased legacies, and imposed terror as a method of rule. Although later Mongol rulers adopted elements of Persian culture and converted to Islam, the collective trauma of the invasions remained embedded in Persian memory for generations. A society once prosperous and sophisticated entered a prolonged period of stagnation and painful reconstruction. Civil administration gave way to unstable military rule. Many important urban centers lost their economic and political relevance entirely. Trade routes were disrupted, universities and centers of learning were destroyed, and agricultural production collapsed. Recovery was slow and fragmented, as local dynasties operating under Mongol dominance lacked stability or sufficient authority to restore earlier prosperity. Power was concentrated in the hands of Mongol military governors who, despite eventually absorbing local customs, ruled the region under constant threat of violence and insecurity. What had already been devastating under Mongol rule became even more destructive in the 14th century with the rise of Tamerlane, also known as Timur. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, Tamerlane claimed his military legacy and sought to rebuild a vast empire through relentless warfare. His campaigns were marked by large-scale destruction, mass executions, and the deliberate use of terror as a political tool. Persian cities that had begun to recover were again reduced to ruins. Isfahan alone is reported to have lost more than 70,000 inhabitants in a single massacre, according to contemporary sources. Despite being a patron of architecture and the arts in his capital, Samarkand, Tamerlane showed little interest in rebuilding Persia itself. His impact there was overwhelmingly destructive. Each conquest was followed by looting, slaughter, and devastation. Unlike earlier Mongol rulers who gradually integrated into Persian society, Tamerlane employed destruction as a deliberate strategy of domination. His campaigns left behind ruined cities, abandoned farmlands, and a population further impoverished and traumatized. Persia, already weakened, was pushed into yet another cycle of collapse. Even amid this chaos, Persian culture demonstrated remarkable resilience. Poets, architects, and scholars continued to preserve elements of Iranian heritage, even while surrounded by ruins. Several masterpieces of Persian literature emerged during this era of adversity, reflecting a society that endured destruction while maintaining cultural continuity. Nevertheless, scientific, political, and institutional development was severely hindered. The social structure of Persia would take centuries to stabilize, and the scars left by Tamerlane would remain visible until the rise of the Safavid dynasties. The Mongol invasions and the campaigns of Tamerlane were not merely episodes of conquest, but true historical cataclysms. They reshaped the physical landscape, political order, and psychological memory of Persia.
The splendor of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian eras now seemed distant and almost mythical. Yet, even after being crushed by two of the most violent military forces in history, Persia did not vanish. It endured through language, art, memory, and continuity, slowly preparing for another resurgence that would redefine its place in the world.
In the early 16th century, after centuries of political fragmentation, foreign invasions, and unstable rule, Persia underwent a huge process of unification under the leadership of the Safavid dynasty. In 1501, Ismail I, then only 14 years old, conquered Tabriz and proclaimed himself Shah, marking the beginning of the Safavid Empire. This event signaled the rebirth of a centralized Persian state for the first time in nearly 1,000 years since the fall of the Sassanid Empire. The Safavid rise was not only political, but also religious and cultural, deeply redefining the history of Iran and Persian civilization. For the first time since antiquity, Persia re-emerged as a cohesive political entity, with relatively stable borders and a strong central authority. One of the most decisive acts of Ismail I's rule was the adoption of Twelver Shiite Islam as the official state religion. Until then, most of the Islamic world, including the Persian regions, was predominantly Sunni. The imposition of Shi'ism represented a profound break with the recent past and established a distinct religious identity for Persia. This decision had lasting implications, both internal and external. Internally, the state began organizing its religious, legal, and educational institutions based on Shiite doctrine. Externally, Persia distinguished itself from its main rivals, especially the Sunni Ottoman Empire, creating a religious divide that would shape Middle Eastern politics for centuries. The consolidation of Shi'ism in Persia did not occur immediately or uniformly. Much of the population was originally Sunni, and the transition required a prolonged effort by the state. Shiite clerics were brought in from regions such as Lebanon and Iraq to structure the new religious orthodoxy. Madrasas were founded, courts reorganized, and religious practices standardized. Over the decades, Shi'ism became deeply rooted in Persian society, becoming a central element of Persian culture and national Iranian identity. This process not only transformed the religiosity of ancient Iran, but also provided a solid ideological foundation for Safavid power. From an administrative and military perspective, the Safavids rebuilt the Persian state, drawing from both Islamic models and earlier traditions from ancient Persia. The central government was strengthened, the tax system reorganized, and the army reformed. A key role was played by the Kizilbash, a confederation of Turkmen tribes that supported the Safavid rise militarily. Over time, however, the Shahs sought to reduce the power of these tribes by creating a more professional army loyal to the state. This centralization allowed for greater internal stability and ensured the empire's survival amid constant external pressures. During the reign of Abbas the Great, known as Abbas the Great, the Safavid Empire reached its peak. The capital was moved to Isfahan, which became one of the largest urban and cultural centers of the Islamic world. Grand architectural works were built, including mosques, palaces, bridges, and monumental squares. Isfahan became a symbol of the Persian Renaissance, reflecting a blend of Persian tradition, Islamic aesthetics, and state power. Trade flourished, driven by Persia's strategic position along routes connecting east and west, including the Silk Road. On the international stage, the Safavid Empire played a central role in the regional balance of power. Its rivalry with the Ottoman Empire led to several military conflicts, especially over control of eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Iraq.
At the same time, the Safavids established diplomatic and commercial relations with European powers, such as England, Portugal, and the Netherlands, which were interested in containing Ottoman expansion and securing access to eastern trade routes. These alliances positioned Persia as an active player in the global political system of the time, reinforcing its importance among late ancient and early modern empires. The Safavid Renaissance and the institutionalization of Shi'ism had lasting effects that extended beyond the empire itself. The religious and political identity shaped during this period remains one of the central pillars of contemporary Iran. The distinction between a predominantly Shiite Iran and its Sunni neighbors was solidified at this historical moment. More than a simple return to power, the Safavid period represented the redefinition of Persia within the Islamic world, combining ancient legacies with new political and religious structures. This newly established Persian state was now prepared for the challenges and interventions that would mark the coming centuries.
After the cultural and political peak of the Safavid Empire, Persia entered a long process of weakening that would extend over the following centuries. This decline had multiple causes, beginning with internal instability triggered by poorly organized successions and disputes over the throne. The death of strong rulers such as Abbas the Great left a power vacuum that was not filled with the same level of competence. Internal conflicts among elite factions, administrative corruption, and the growing autonomy of regional governors gradually undermined state cohesion. The central authority, once firm, slowly eroded, leaving Persia vulnerable to external pressures and invasions. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape of Asia and Europe was changing rapidly. While Persia struggled with internal crises, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire expanded their spheres of influence and saw Persian weakness as an opportunity. Russia, in particular, began to exert pressure along the Caucasus frontier, a region historically contested between the two empires. From the 18th century onward, Persia was forced to confront Russian military advances and suffered significant territorial losses, including regions such as Georgia and Azerbaijan. Persian diplomacy attempted negotiations, but it rarely managed to resist the military strength and ambitions of rising imperial powers. In the early 19th century, the foreign threat was no longer limited to military pressure and became increasingly economic and political. Great Britain, eager to protect its interests in India, became more deeply involved in Persian internal affairs. It imposed unequal treaties, influenced political appointments, and intervened in succession disputes. Persian territory, due to its strategic position between the Middle East, the Caucasus, and South Asia, became a chessboard for colonial interests. The so-called Great Game, the silent struggle between Britain and Russia for control over Central Asia, had Persia as one of its main arenas. Internally, the country also faced severe economic difficulties. Infrastructure deteriorated, tax collection was inefficient, and the rural population suffered from poverty, famine, and lack of rights. Attempts at modernization encountered resistance from conservative elites and a state unable to reform itself effectively. Local industries could not compete with European goods, which entered the country through trade agreements imposed by force. The Persian economy became increasingly dependent on foreign capital and loans, whose interest rates further eroded national sovereignty. The empire that had once been the beating heart of Asia now staggered under the pressures of a rapidly changing modern world. In various regions of the country, resistance movements emerged against foreign domination and state decline. Local revolts, led by clerics, tribal leaders, and intellectuals, began to challenge both domestic rulers and the influence of foreign powers.
A notable example was the constitutional movement of the early 20th century, which sought to limit the Shah's authority and implement a modern constitution with a parliament and written laws. Although it achieved important gains, such as the creation of the Majlis, the Persian parliament, the movement faced strong repression and direct interference from Western powers, which feared losing influence in a strategically vital region. By this stage, Persia was no longer a sovereign empire like in the days of Cyrus, Darius, or Abbas. Major political decisions were routinely subject to the tacit or explicit approval of foreign ambassadors. Railways, mines, and public services were frequently granted to British and Russian companies that exploited the country's natural resources. Oil, discovered on Persian soil in the early 20th century, became a new instrument of domination. Western companies obtained exclusive concessions, while the Persian population continued to live in poverty under an increasingly weak and divided state. The decline of Persia was not solely the result of external forces, but of a complex combination of internal disorganization and a rapidly transforming world. The ancient civilization that had given rise to great empires and had endured countless invasions now found itself surrounded, infiltrated, and manipulated by powers that dominated the modern world. Yet, despite the institutional decay, Persian identity remained alive in customs, language, religion, and historical memory. It was this identity, cultivated over millennia, that would later fuel future struggles for independence, sovereignty, and national renewal in the 20th century.
By the late 1970s, Iran, then ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was experiencing growing tension between the central government and broad sectors of society. Although the country displayed signs of modernization through infrastructure projects, industrialization, and foreign investment, this progress was widely perceived as superficial, unequal, and subordinated to Western interests. The regime's repression, symbolized by the feared secret police, Savak, and the forced westernization of cultural and religious life fueled a sense of national alienation. Large segments of the population viewed the Shah's government as authoritarian, corrupt, and increasingly detached from Islamic values and Iranian traditions. Various groups began organizing against the regime, including liberals, communists, students, intellectuals, religious figures, and urban workers. However, it was the Shiite clergy, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, that succeeded in channeling and unifying this discontent into a cohesive revolutionary force. Exiled since 1964 for criticizing the regime, Khomeini continued to influence events through speeches distributed on cassette tapes and clandestine messages, denouncing the Shah's submission to imperial powers and calling for a return to Islamic principles. His figure grew as a focal point of religious and moral authority, becoming the principal voice of an alternative future for Iran. The situation worsened in 1978 when protests erupted in cities across the country. The government responded with violence, leading to deaths that in turn fueled further unrest, creating a cycle of repression and resistance. Strikes in strategic sectors, especially oil, paralyzed the economy. Massive demonstrations demanded the end of the monarchy and Khomeini's return. Support from the United States, once firm, began to waver as instability increased. In January 1979, under pressure from sustained protests and lacking political backing, the Shah left Iran for exile, marking the collapse of one of the most powerful regimes in the Middle East. With the Shah's departure, Khomeini's return to Iran in February 1979 was triumphant. Welcomed by millions, he quickly assumed leadership of a new order and called for a referendum that approved the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The monarchy was formally abolished, replaced by a theocratic political system based on the doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih, granting ultimate authority to a supreme religious jurist. Khomeini became the supreme leader, combining religious and political power and fundamentally transforming the country's institutional structure. The revolution had profound repercussions not only within Iran, but across the Muslim world and beyond. The model established by Khomeini inspired Islamist movements elsewhere and alarmed conservative monarchies in the region, which feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. At the same time, relations with the West, especially the United States, deteriorated rapidly. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran by Iranian students and the prolonged hostage crisis sealed the rupture, inaugurating decades of hostility and sanctions between the two countries. Domestically, the new regime implemented sweeping reforms based on Islamic jurisprudence, including changes in education, the judicial system, women's roles, and cultural regulation. The state became highly centralized, with the clergy exerting strong control over media, the economy, and social norms. Although many groups, including secular ones, initially supported the revolution, it soon became clear that the new regime would not tolerate dissent. Aspirations for freedom and national sovereignty gave way to a rigid system marked by persecution of opponents, political executions, and press repression. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 stands as one of the most significant events of the 20th century, redefining Iranian national identity and altering the balance of power in the Middle East. It represented a decisive break with Iran's recent past while invoking long-standing traditions of religious authority and resistance. Iran emerged with a new role on the global stage as a theocratic republic challenging the liberal Western order, asserting autonomy and deeply rooted in its historical, cultural, and spiritual legacy. This transformation set the stage for new tensions and reshaped the trajectory of the ancient Persian world in the modern era.
In the 21st century, Iran maintained a central geopolitical role in the Middle East, marked by an assertive and often confrontational foreign policy. The Islamic Republic continued its revolutionary legacy by positioning itself as a counterweight to Western presence in the region, especially that of the United States and its Gulf allies. This stance placed the country in constant tension with other regional powers, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. Moreover, Iran adopted a strategy of asymmetric deterrence, expanding its influence through non-state allies and armed militias. Even under harsh sanctions, it sought to consolidate itself as an independent regional power. One of the main fronts of this strategy was the strengthening of the so-called axis of resistance, formed by ideological and strategic allies in different countries. In Lebanon, Iran strongly supported Hezbollah, a Shiite group that became an influential political and military force. In Yemen, it backed the Houthi rebels in their war against the Saudi-led coalition. In Iraq, it established ties with various Shiite militias that gained strength after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And in Syria, it was one of the main pillars of Bashar al-Assad's regime during the civil war. This network expanded Iran's reach, but also placed it at the center of multiple regional crises. Tensions with the West intensified from the 2000s onward, especially due to Iran's nuclear program. Although the country always claimed that its program was for peaceful purposes, Western powers, led by the U.S., feared the potential development of nuclear weapons. This led to successive rounds of economic sanctions, affecting key sectors such as oil, banking, and international trade. Nevertheless, Iran stood firm in its rhetoric of sovereignty and resisted the pressure, which further deepened mutual distrust. The nuclear issue would become the centerpiece of international negotiations in the following years. In 2015, after years of stalemate, Iran signed the nuclear deal, JCPOA, with the 5 permanent members at a UN Security Council, plus Germany. The agreement required limitations on uranium enrichment in exchange for sanction relief.
For a brief period, the country experienced economic and diplomatic openness. However, in 2018, under President Donald Trump, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the deal and reinstated sanctions. This decision deeply damaged trust among the parties and led Iran to resume parts of its nuclear program, reigniting international tensions. The escalation continued in 2020 when the U.S. assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard, in an airstrike in Baghdad. Soleimani was one of the most influential figures in Iran's foreign policy, responsible for coordinating with allied militias in various countries. Soleimani's death was considered an act of war by Tehran, which promised revenge and intensified its anti-American rhetoric. At the same time, the episode demonstrated Iran's determination to maintain its regional policy, even in the face of direct military threats. The response came in the form of missile attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq, along with strengthened alliances on other fronts. With increasing Western isolation, Iran sought to reinforce partnerships with other global powers. In 2021, it signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with China, involving investments in energy, transportation, and defense. The alliance with Russia also deepened, especially in the Syrian war and in matters of defense and trade. These moves indicate a clear attempt to reshape its international positioning, distancing itself from the Western axis and seeking support in a more multipolar global order. Meanwhile, the Iranian population continues to face economic hardship, inflation, and internal protests, pressuring the regime to balance foreign strategy with domestic stability. Despite internal and external pressures, Iran remains one of the most influential powers in the Middle East, playing a decisive role in regional conflicts and global negotiations. Its ambiguous posture of resistance and at the same time strategic diplomacy makes it both feared and courted by different international actors. The 21st century is still unfolding, but one thing is certain: Iran will remain a key player on the global stage, shaping alliances, challenging powers, and asserting its presence in an ever-changing world.
Despite facing countless invasions, revolutions, and transformations throughout its history, Persian civilization has shown a remarkable ability to endure. Even when foreign empires dominated its territory, such as the Arabs, Mongols, Turks, or British, the soul of Persia was never extinguished. Its core elements, language, literature, ethical values, and worldview, adapted without being erased. This resilience became one of the most defining traits of the Iranian people, who learned to be politically submissive yet culturally sovereign. Modern Iran still explicitly carries this millennia-old continuity. One of the main pillars of this persistence is the Persian language, Farsi, which resisted attempts to be replaced during Arab rule. Although the alphabet was adapted to the Arabic system, the structure, sound, and vocabulary of Persian survived and flourished. Iranian poets and thinkers used their native tongue not only to express aesthetic beauty, but also national pride and historical memory. The Shahnameh, written by Ferdowsi, was a milestone in this process, an epic that rescued myths and kings from pre-Islamic Iran, reinforcing Persian identity during a time of intense Arabization. Medieval Persian literature became one of the richest and most influential in the Islamic world. Poets like Rumi, Hafez, and Saadi not only immortalized spiritual and philosophical values, but also spread Persian tradition across vast regions of the East. Their verses transcended borders, being admired in Turkey, India, the Arab world, and even the West. Moreover, this literary production was not only an art form, but a way to transmit wisdom,
preserve ancient Persian ethics and build bridges to the present. Poetry became a form of resistance and cultural pride. In architecture and visual arts, Persian civilization also left marks that withstand the test of time. Iranian aesthetics are easily recognizable in ornate domes, colorful tiles, symmetrical gardens, and intricate calligraphy. Cities like Isfahan and Shiraz still preserve buildings that express a fusion between Persian tradition and Islamic art, with original elements that were assimilated by other cultures. This influence extended to the Mughal Empire in India and the Ottoman Empire, proving that Persian art not only survived, it helped shape the aesthetic tastes of later civilizations. Another deep aspect of Persian continuity lies in spirituality. Although the country officially adopted Shiite Islam in the 16th century, many practices and spiritual values were already part of the ancient Zoroastrian tradition. The pursuit of balance, justice, truth, and light, core elements of Zoroastrianism, remained present, even when adapted into Islamic religious language. Furthermore, Sufi mysticism found fertile ground in Persia, where spirituality was valued as a path of inner transformation. This fusion gave Iran a unique, profound, and philosophical religious character. Culturally, millennia-old traditions continue to be proudly celebrated. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, is perhaps the strongest example, a Zoroastrian ritual that predates Islam, still celebrated today by millions of Iranians and neighboring peoples. It symbolizes renewal, light, nature, and family, concepts deeply rooted in the Persian soul. Even modern religious governments, such as the current theocratic regime, have not been able to erase these secular festivals. They reveal that beyond institutional religion, there's a living civilization pulsing through everyday Iranian life. Ultimately, Persian civilization survives because it is rooted not only in monuments or ancient texts, but in the way Iranians think, live, and see themselves. Modern Persian identity is a fusion of past and present, tradition and reinvention. This continuity gives Iran a solid foundation in the face of political uncertainty and geopolitical conflict. Persia is not just a distant memory. It is a living organism, breathing through language, art, spirituality, and the pride of a people who never stopped recognizing themselves as heirs of one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations in human history.
Over the centuries, Persian civilization crossed deep chasms of destruction, religious transformation, foreign conquest, and internal revolution. Even when confronted by the most powerful forces of their eras, from Alexander the Great to Arab caliphates, Mongol armies, and modern Western empires, Persia endured. It survived not merely as a political entity, but as a continuous cultural, intellectual, and spiritual identity. Modern Iran, despite all its transformations, still carries the deep imprint that its millennia-old past. Language, customs, art, and philosophical outlooks all echo figures such as Cyrus, Darius, Avicenna, and countless others. The legacy of Persia can be felt not only within its borders, but across regions shaped by its ideas, administrative systems, and enduring influence. From the Caucasus to South Asia, from the Islamic world to echoes felt in Western political thought, Persian concepts left long-lasting marks. The notion of a centralized state, administrative tolerance of diverse peoples, and the institutional value placed on knowledge and learning all emerged from Persian foundations. These elements did not vanish with the fall of empires, but were absorbed, adapted, and transmitted forward through history. This legacy, however, is not static or frozen in time. It continues to evolve, resist, and reassert itself in the present.
It appears in cultural traditions preserved across generations, in festivals, literature, and architecture, and in the national consciousness of the Iranian people. Even amid sanctions, wars, and ideological conflict, there remains a collective awareness of belonging to one of the world's oldest civilizations. The history of Persia is not a broken line. It is a current that flows beneath the surface, sometimes unseen but never extinguished. Understanding the trajectory of Persian civilization also helps illuminate the foundations of the modern world. Major global powers, past and present, have repeatedly crossed paths with Iran, often underestimating the historical weight carried by this land. Yet as this documentary has shown, Persia has repeatedly re-emerged in new forms. Whether under Zoroastrian belief, Shiite Islam, monarchy, or the modern Islamic Republic, the underlying continuity of identity and statecraft has remained intact. This documentary sought not merely to recount a sequence of events, but to convey the depth of a civilization that was never erased, even when crushed at critical moments. The surviving ruins of Persepolis, the preservation of ancient texts, the endurance of oral traditions, all remind us that a people's legacy extends far beyond political systems. It lives in symbols, myths, architecture, language, and collective memory passed from generation to generation. Seen through this lens, the Middle East appears not only as a region of modern conflict, but as a landscape shaped by ancient struggles for continuity, sovereignty, and identity. Persia, known today as Iran, is not simply a contemporary political actor. It represents an entire chapter of human history still being written, shaped by resilience, transformation, and historical depth that continues to influence the world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive more videos like this. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in this type of topic, take a look at the video about the history of the Roman Empire. It might interest you as well. Thank you very much for watching until the end, and see you in the next video.